So my family and I were driving through lots of very big snowflakes, trying to get the base of the ski mountain to find a parking space. We're looking around for a place to park, and I see this sign saying, "Park courageously." So I reached deep inside myself, and I parked like I'd never parked before. It was only after we got all our equipment out, we're walking back past the sign, that I realized I misread it, and it actually said "Park courteously." So this got me to thinking a little bit about the idea of, courage. What is courage? What would it look like when we actually use courage? Now that I vanquished 5 cars and have parking, but what would it actually look like for me to use courage in my work? And what would it look like to deploy courageously? And when we think of courage, we sometimes think of, risk and how you manage risk. But one of the interesting things I realized is that being courageous does not mean being reckless. And so that brings us to what we want to talk about today, which is rapid deployment in organizations that are terrified of risk. And I thought about titling this "Courageous Deployment," but I wasn't sure if that would be likely to get picked as a title. So let's look at an example of somebody we admire for their courage. We've got Captain Kirk here talking to Scotty. And Captain Kirk is asking Scotty for more power because that's what, and I realize that Scotty has purple hair, I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but Captain Kirk is asking Scotty for more power because that's what Captain Kirk usually asks Scotty for. And Scotty says, "No problem, we can reroute some power and make this happen." And Kirk says, that's great. How much effort will this take for you to do this? And Scotty says, "Not much, I need to change 3 lines of code, and I need to move a few wires, it'll probably take me about 20 minutes. So Kirk says, "Okay, go make that happen." And Scotty says, "Okay, well, while I do this, I need you to go talk to change management, because it's probably going to be at least 6 months before they let us actually deploy this into production." And so how many have work at organizations that are something like this? You've got something you need to do, and you've got this huge thing over there. So what I'd really like to tell you is three ways you can lower your risk and just fix all your problems with change management. Unfortunately, I can't, because there's really no silver bullet here. But what I can tell you about is some of the work, some of the lessons I've learned, and some of the stuff I've been doing with the Treasury and Federal Reserve banks over the past few years. One example is taking a system rewrite where we were able to take a system that was deploying every 6 months and get down to 7-day deployment, which if you're used to deploying every day, that's great. For the Treasury, this worked really well. And the big difference here is this was a system where they just happened to be deploying every 7 days for the last few years. The actual time to deploy is much, much shorter than that, something measured in days. And these are also systems too that move fast, break things. That may work for cat pictures. It doesn't necessarily work when something that's like underpinning your government's economy. So if we look at this, there's 2 parts of this. One part is we need to lower risk, right? We want to deploy rapidly. We need some way to bring the risk down. It's very important. We have to do that. Another part, sometimes can be more difficult, is actually selling the lower risk to change management. So let's look at those. So when it comes to risk, there's 2 parts, or 2 ways that I like to think about risk, kind of divided up. And one is we've got the risk of changes to the environment, so our deployment risk. Then we've got changes to the application, or our development risk. And let's look at both of those. So mitigating those risks. So mitigating development risk, some of the things that work well for that, and there's lots of ways to do this, but I'm just going to call out a few. We've got test-driven development, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, and a lot of you are probably using. If you're not, it's this type of loop. You write a simple test, watch it fail, write code, test passes, refactor, rinse and repeat. Now this is really good at making sure that developers are, that the application is doing what the developer expects it to do, particularly that the individual pieces are doing what the developer expects it to do. And this is very, very necessary for lowering the risk. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because how the developer sees the application may not be the same as what the business owner is seeing or expecting. Which brings us to the next thing, using behavior-driven development, or BDD. And BDD, if you're not familiar with it, basically says we've got business owner language over here, and we've got developer language over here, and if we could actually find an intersection here where we could both talk the same thing, talking in a language the business owner understands that's close enough to English, but yet be structured enough we can actually make it executable, we can work together a lot better. So you end up with stuff, if you're using Cucumber, there's lots of other ways to do this too, but you end up with things that are written kind of like this. Given I'm not an admin user, when I log into the system, then I cannot see the admin menu. That specifies a rule for the system, but it's structured in a way that you can actually make it executable and test it against the system. And then the inverse of it, given I am an admin user, when I log into the system, then I can see the admin. So you end up with this kind of outer loop of writing a scenario, watching it fail, make it executable, write the code, scenario passes. And this outer loop being driven by whatever the business owner is wanting to see happen. You put those two things together, and you end up with something like this. This outer loop is being driven by the way the system is specified to work. And then an inner loop here that's being specified by how the developer knows the system needs to function in the individual pieces to get that outer loop to pass. So what does this do to your risk or your ability to deploy quickly? Well, first of all, it gives you a lot better communication between the people that are writing the software and the people that know what it's supposed to do. It's a lot easier if you can start building what the customer actually wants. I don't know if you've been in situations, I know I've been in situations where we built exactly what the customer asked for, got into production and then discovered what they asked for and what they wanted were not the same thing at all. This helps alleviate that. The other really, really big piece is if you're doing your development like this, you end up with a huge set of regression tests that you can run every time you get ready you want to deploy to make sure that your application does exactly what it has been specified it needs to do. And this has a huge impact on your ability to have courage when you deploy, knowing that you've actually dealt with all the risks. Of course, for that to work, you're going to need some type of continuous integration, which I'm sure, how many people are using continuous integration in one form or another? Okay, most people. Another piece of lowering the risk that was kind of interesting is version control. And we usually think of version control, this is what lets me undo something that's wrong, right? Version control also has the ability, if you're using it in small changes, which we'll talk about a little bit, of giving you a lot of visibility into what you've actually changed and being able to see the difference between what's in production and what am I doing, what am I wanting to deploy. And if you're dealing with 10, maybe 20, 30, even 100 lines of code, the visibility of being able to see that is a huge benefit in lowering the risk. Which brings us to this idea of very small changes. And if, let's say you've got two changes you're making, and so you're going to be dealing with something like two points of interaction. You get up to 6 changes, now you're dealing with 30 points of interaction, 12 changes, and now you've got this mess here of 132 points of interaction. Now, if you're deploying something to production, and this is one thing that you could be deploying to production, and this is another thing you could be deploying to production, and let's say there's a problem in this interaction right here. Which one do you think you can actually spot? There's no way you're going to see that one. As a matter of fact, if this looks scary over here, it should, because this thing over here is actually... So that's the Death Star. And that point down there that we had, that problem, that's the exhaust pit. You know, it's where if something goes wrong, the entire thing falls apart. So with what we're talking about there, we have this idea, this kind of risk profile. We've got our risk goes up, the more complicated our changes. So the simpler we can make our changes, the more we can push it over there, the lower our risk. And so here's our Death Star, many changes, few changes over there. And the reason the graph's drawn like this is because we can actually use this to represent deployment frequency. Because the longer you wait to deploy something, the more you're going to have to deploy with it, unless you just want to pay developers to sit around and not write any code, right? You know, if you're going to deploy every 6 months and you want your developers doing something, you're going to have lots and lots of changes if that's your deployment frequency. If you can deploy every day or every week or every 2 weeks or whatever that is, you can end up with much smaller changes and lower the risk through that. So here's our Death Star simple deployment frequency. So this brings us to continuous deployment. And a lot of people, I think, start thinking continuous deployment is where you're deploying multiple times a day. You know, it's what Facebook does. It's what these big companies do. And since I can only deploy every week or every 2 weeks, then I'm not actually doing continuous deployment. And I want to suggest that continuous deployment is very, very organizationally specific. You know, it depends on what you're doing for your particular needs in your organization. And the big thing that I would shoot for in continuous deployment isn't how fast you can deploy, but can you have a deployment process where you're pulling stuff into production without having a bunch of impediments that are causing you to back work up, right? If that happens to be every week that you're deploying, you may still be just as continuously deploying because you're not actually backing stuff up. That's not the place that's keeping you from deploying your small changes into production. So keep this profile in mind, this graph, and now let's jump over and look at mitigating deployment risk. So on deployment risk, most companies tend to look at it something like this. So this is the opposite of that other graph. And deployment risk is something like a rocket launch. You know, we're going to do this once, and we're going to get everybody on deck for the whole weekend, and hopefully it doesn't blow up. But we know if we do it enough times, something really bad is going to happen, and we're going to end up with, you know, this. And side note on this, so this is a NASA launch that did not go well. But if you go to NASA's site and try to look for rocket explosions, you won't find anything, because that's not what they call this. They call it an anomaly. And that particular one is a catastrophic anomaly. And I wonder if there's some lessons here for how we refer to problems. You know, the server didn't crash, it suffered an anomaly. You know, this may be good marketing information here. Anyway, here's our graph. We've got a single rocket launch. You know, it's lower risk, we're gonna do it one time. Up here, we did a bunch of them, and we ended up with our catastrophic anomaly. So if we put these two graphs together, so we've got our deployment risk going down like this by doing it more frequently. We've got our development risk going down like this by doing it more frequently. We've got our deployment risk going up like this, and so there's this conflict happening. So here's our way too many things on a slide. But what most organizations end up doing is they end up saying, okay, well, we want to deploy somewhere in here. You know, we're going to kind of split the difference and find the way to balance these two things because they're inherently in conflict in the way that we're working. So here recently in Houston, there were a bunch of people out of power. And there was some subset of those people that were almost excited to be out of power because they had bought a generator a few years ago knowing something like this was going to occur. And if you have a generator and the power goes out, it's kind of like, yes, my investment paid off. Well, a lot of these people had these generators and they got ready to use it and they went to fire them up and nothing happened. They'd either frozen up or whatever. You know, they've been sitting in the garage for 3 years and never maintained or run, so it doesn't work. On the other hand, I've got a generator in my house, and every Wednesday, it took me a while to get used to this, but it fires off at 2 o'clock every Wednesday and runs and tests the cutover process and everything works correctly. Makes sure everything works correctly, and then notifies me if there's a problem with it. Well, that's automation. My generator and the chances of my generator working are much, much higher because we test it every single week as opposed to the one that's just sitting in the garage. So notice, it's not just that we have the possibility to exercise it, it's the fact that we actually do it and it gets exercised on a regular basis. And when you think about it, this is what SpaceX is doing, right? Have you guys seen that video where they show all their failed landing attempts? And it's just like anomaly after anomaly after anomaly of them trying to do this over and over again because they're trying to execute the process repeatedly and as rapidly as possible to get the risk out of the system. So if you're able to take the automation in what you're doing and take these high-risk events, instead of trying to find the best compromise between it, you can actually take it and use automation to shove this way. And now, the more frequently you can deploy, or for some amount of frequent deployments, you can actually lower the risk on both sides of things, both your deployment risk and your development risk. Which brings us to the whole DevOps thing. That's what you're trying to do here, is get that risk profile looking where it's all headed down the same direction. A couple of the ways to do that is having multiple environments, whether these are things you're doing in containers or virtual or doing things in the cloud, and lots of different ways to actually lower this risk. And I would love to talk to you guys about different things we've found and hear things that you've had that worked well. Another great place to look is all these people. Most of these companies here are in one way or another trying to provide stuff that will lower your risk one way or another. Even the coffee, right? You know, because if you're sleepy when you're making decisions, bad things can happen. So check out some things here. I know I've learned a lot just by talking to people at the tables out there. Okay, so that was looking at how to actually lower the risk. Now let's talk about the hard part, right? Selling this to change management. One of the things that was most interesting in working with some of the stuff with the Treasury is I started out with the assumption that all the controls that were in place, all the things we had to meet, were going to be the barriers to getting stuff done. And maybe this is unique to Treasury, but I'm guessing it's probably not. A lot of these controls are actually really, really well thought out. Now, so the controls really are your friend. Now, the culture may not be your friend, and the way we've always done it before and the way we've always interpreted those controls before may not be your friend. One of the things we did at the Treasury that really helped a lot is we went in and did massive amounts of education. I spent about 2 months in a little data center in West Virginia just training people on different things, even people that weren't really working directly with our product, But the goal was to build this level of support and understanding, so when we came through and said, we're going to use these tools to do rapid deployment, and here's how we're going to do it, there wasn't just a resistance because it was unknown. There were people seeing the tools and understanding how they would actually work together. So I did classes on Git and Chef classes and classes on Flyaway, which is what we're using for automatic schema upgrade tool. And some of these things were interesting because they actually supported the controls better than what people were doing today. But they wouldn't know that unless we actually built the foundation of people understanding how the tools worked. Even if it was just not real detailed understanding, but just understanding overall. Code analysis was another way that we did things with change management that I wasn't really anticipating how powerful it was to them. So we're using stuff like Sonar, Fortify. Cast was a big one because in this particular situation, they had brought in Cast on some other projects. Cast is a code analysis tool. The results were so bad that they just decided to shut it off on some of these other projects. So they got all these things saying, hey, these could be potential problems, but there were so many of them, they decided the right thing to do was just ignore it and shut down the whole system that was scanning it. So Cast had a good reputation with this particular part of things as being a very high barrier to get to. But it also gave us the ability to see some overall trends and be able to say, here's how our software is progressing over time. And something I hadn't ever thought of before, there's some ways to do this, but actually benchmarking and being able to say, our source code looks like this compared to all the other code that's been scanned in the financial industry. And that has if you say we're in the 90th percentile, that really changes how you start thinking about the risk of your code versus if you say we're in the 5th percentile or the results are so bad we're just going to shut this whole thing off. So it had a lot of political value. And one thing when working with change management is I like technical stuff. I like things that are actually going to lower risk. But don't overlook the political value of something because this can be a great tool in actually getting changes through that you're working on. Selling DevOps to change management was interesting because when we started talking about all the stuff we wanted to automate, we started getting lots of pushback at first on, well, we've got these audit controls. And what was interesting is when we went back and said, okay, what's the actual control we're wanting to meet? Not how have you been doing it, but what's the control you're actually wanting to meet? And they'd explain, and then we'd say, well, here's how we're wanting to do it and how we think it meets the control. So how are you doing this today? And they talk about, well, we upgrade databases by having somebody log into the system, and then they run the script and type a few things like that. And then we start saying, okay, but how would you actually audit that? And after a while, some of the resistance started going away, and I'm not sure if it's because they were on board or because they thought we better be quiet, or they're going to shut down the way we've been doing this for the past 10 years because it doesn't actually meet the controls that we're supposed to meet. Same thing with traceability. In the system that we were using, everything was checked in as a single version number. So you had a version number that represented the entire state of the system, the environments, and everything. And you could always trace back and say who made this change and where was it approved, all just through the version control. So rapid deployment, selling rapid deployment. In the government, at least the areas I've worked with, they have this idea of a standard change. And you probably have, if you're working in a sufficiently large organization, you probably have something that's a standard change, which is something that needs to be done frequently, and specifically it needs to be a very small number of changes, which is perfect, because that's exactly what we wanted, right? We wanted to push out very small number of changes. But while this is what the definition was, this is what the culture considered to be a small change, right? It's this, and particularly this part of the version number. So when we started asking about deployment, they're like, okay, if you're going from 2.0.10 to 2.0.11, that's great. That's a small number of changes. If you're going from 2.0.10 to 2.1.1, that's no good because that's obviously a bigger change, regardless of what was actually in the source code. But that's a cultural thing that we can live with. So after the first year of running, we were looking at something like this. We were on version 2.0.2367. And they were all very happy because we had only changed the number that meant it was a small change, right? We were very happy because we had deployed very small changes as each of those. So it was a win-win for everybody. Another piece was the stand-up meeting. We took all the change management meetings and said, if you have a say in what goes out to deployment, you come to the stand-up meeting, instead of having these other meetings kind of called on an ad hoc basis. And at first, we thought we were going to get a lot of resistance, but it turned out people really liked it because they knew what was going on, and they were actually able to add value as part of the change management process, instead of just getting all this stuff that they didn't know what it meant with a bunch of pressure to go live. Jira became the system that we were using for any artifacts, like if there were any approvals or anything, and very, very lightweight. Just the person that needs to approve it adds a comment, and that's how we say that they approved it. Version control, as I mentioned, gave us a lot of insight of if you wanted to know, instead of trying to take apart our jar and figure out what's in it, even by developers that didn't really know what any of the stuff meant, they could look in version control and see what the differences were between the two versions. So what's the value of this? Well, for the government and for you as taxpayers, it's pretty significant. Here's an example. There was one of the systems was dealing with payments that were going out and then comparing them to debts that people had to the government, and make sure you don't pay somebody that owes you money. You know, that's a logical thing to do. Some of the debts were coming from systems that formatted them a little bit differently. So it was like a two-line change once this was discovered to make the change. Simple change, got it out into production, and it started collecting $200,000 more. Now, this $200,000 of money that doesn't need to be raised in taxes from people like you. So this is a very patriotic moment right here when you start realizing this. And that's $200,000 per week. You know, so this is pretty significant. Well, under the old way of doing it, so here's how that looks from a cost standpoint. So if it takes a week to get it out into production, let's say from the time that we identified it, we get it out in a week, just because that's the average time. This one may have been a lot faster. We missed that $200,000 during that week. On the other hand, if we had to have this and then wait for 6 months, that's how much that cost. And that's a difference of $5 million. This is pretty significant. And so if you're dealing with an organization that's starting to say, well, how much does rapid deployment cost? We're not sure we want to invest in this. You can really turn the question around and say, how much is slow deployment costing you now? Because it's probably really significant if you can just sit down and find a way to quantify it. And maybe it's not $5 million, but I was talking to a game company about what we were doing and the rapid deployment. They said, you know what, if we could get stuff out as fast as you were getting stuff out, that would be worth like $50,000 to us. Well, for a company that's employing 5 people, that's pretty significant. So why doesn't this happen naturally? And I think a lot of this has to do with how organizations react to stress. And if there's this continuum from automation, from manual effort all the way up to automation, if you're somewhere here on the continuum and a bad event happens, your reaction is to move down, right? To create more manual processes. I've seen this happen where the reaction was, we're going to introduce a 2-week wait. There's no really specification of what's going to happen during those 2 weeks or how that adds value, but we've added a manual process to it. On the other hand, and if you're dealing with a risk profile like that, that actually increases your risk, right? Because now you've got 2 weeks of stuff piling up before you actually deploy it. On the other hand, if you're over here and something happens, an event happens and you're fairly automated, the response is usually to move up. Let's solve this with automation so it never happens again. So I think that's why this is difficult and doesn't always happen naturally until you've got some real forces in there to make sure people get above that line, and then it can kind of grow naturally. So it's a self-reinforcing thing. So let's talk about leadership, right? And we usually think of leadership as being the thing that happens at the top of the organization. We want to be led by somebody up there. And I'm going to suggest that leadership is something that really happens at all levels of the organization, and is particularly important when you're trying to deal with your risk. And I want to tell you a story based on this newspaper article I saw years ago when I was living in Michigan. And so this is a story about Jonathan. This is 2004. Jonathan's 17-year-old. Pirates of the Caribbean had just come out recently. Jonathan had a very strong need he was discovering to dress up as a pirate, and his school did not really have sufficient outlets for doing that. So he was looking for ways to dress up as a pirate, and he got to thinking about this parade that they had in town, a really small parade in Holland, Michigan, and there was a single float in this parade every single year, and it was a bank for the bank in town. And so he thought this will be the perfect time, dress up as a pirate, I can get a bunch of my friends together, and we'll jump in behind this boat, and start promoting the National Pirate Association, the North American Pirate Association. So he convinced all his friends of this. And on the day, they all dressed up as pirates, they jumped in behind the boat, everything was going great, people thought it was funny, they were carrying their banner, and then the police realized there weren't supposed to be 19 people dressed like pirates in the parade. And so the police came out, his friends all scattered. The quote Jonathan had, I think, was that he would not abandon his ship. He'd go down with his ship as he waved the sword in the air, and they arrested him, gathered up all the friends, and fined everybody $100. So as a 17-year-old, I know if I had led 18 of my friends into a situation that got them all $100 fines, this would be a pretty significant setback to my position with my friends. And this may sound like, okay, so here's a cautionary tale. As a leader, don't do something stupid that seemed like a good idea and mess up because it will ruin things for you. But the thing that I thought was really interesting about this and the leadership opportunity was what Jonathan did next. And he got a bunch of his friends together, and they announced they were going to dress up like pirates again and have a car wash, and also do some car parking and stuff like that. And they were raising the money to get rid of all their fines. And so he took this situation which, you know, the dressing up like pirates seemed like a great idea at the time, right? To me, it seemed like a great idea. Turned out to be a really bad idea. And what you do in DevOps and in your companies and dealing with risk, this is going to happen. There's going to be things that look like great ideas at the time that once you get into it, it's like, oh yeah, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. But the real test of leadership is whether you're able to take that and then move on from that. And can you fix the problem, come together, work at not just trying to find out who to blame, but actually fix the problem and move forward. So back to our discussion of Captain Kirk and courage. We have, if we think about the future, right, and not just the future in your company, but really way out there future, like reaching the stars or what may happen with artificial intelligence or whatever, we have this innate idea that at some point we're going to have DevOps and we're not going to be deploying with risk. And this thing of Scotty needing to go out and get change management to approve stuff in 6 months just seems like, you know, that's not where the future is. And so I want to encourage you, as the stuff that you're doing, you may be doing small parts in your company of how you manage risk and lower risk and deal with DevOps and getting things out into production. And it may seem like a small thing, but really you're helping change kind of the culture of how we as humans deal with risk and how we deploy software, which may eventually get us to the stars. You know, you're making your own small investment in that. So I want to encourage you that as the stuff that you're doing and the way that you're dealing with risk and trying to move forward, to go out and courageously deploy where no one has rapidly deployed before. So here's a list of some links and contacts. I would love to talk to you guys. Hopefully some of this was helpful, and thank you very much.